AITAH for ghosting my ex because she is married now? When Lisa called, it was as if a part of my past, long since buried, came back to life. It had been 2 years since we broke up. But somehow, it felt like both a lifetime and just yesterday. I'd moved on, or so I'd told myself, and threw myself into my work, my routines, and anything that made me feel grounded after losing someone I'd once thought was my future. And yet, hearing her voice stirred something in me I hadn't allowed myself to acknowledge in a long time. Our relationship had always felt intense, even when it was calm. We met in college, a time when life felt open and hopeful, as if the world lay at our feet, waiting for us to mold it however we wanted. Lisa came from wealth, old money, the kind that afforded opportunities most people could only dream of. But she wore it lightly, rarely flaunting it, and I like to think she saw something in me beyond my modest background and practical nature. We spent 4 years together, falling into an easy rhythm. She laughed easily, carried herself with that effortless elegance people only achieve if they've never had to worry about paying rent or balancing a budget. I, on the other hand, was grounded by necessity. My parents had worked hard for what little they had, and while college was a step forward, I knew my future wouldn't hold the comforts she was accustomed to. I had loans to pay off, a career to build from scratch, and no connections waiting to open doors for me. I thought we'd figure it out, maybe find some middle ground where our differences balanced each other out. But after college, reality set in, and the cracks began to show. I'd taken a job in a small apartment, cheap but decent, close to work, while she struggled with the transition from her college lifestyle to the modest life I could afford. Lisa wanted weekend getaways and dinners at nice places, but my budget couldn't accommodate those things. I was focused on paying down my student loans, eager to build a stable foundation. At first, she seemed to understand, but over time, her frustration grew. She didn't want to live a life of constant compromise, she didn't want to settle. Eventually, she told me she couldn't see a future for us. In my heart, I knew she was right. There was no easy way for me to close the gap between us. She deserved the life she wanted, and I couldn't provide it. Our breakup was hard, but we handled it with mutual respect. Neither of us could have known then that our different worlds would pull us apart. And we clung to our shared memories, staying friends for a while. I even tried to convince myself that someday, I'd be fine just seeing her happy with someone else. For months after the breakup, we were still part of the same social circle. We'd see each other at mutual friends' gatherings, a lingering shadow of what we'd once had, but also a constant reminder of what I'd lost. Over time, though, we drifted. She started dating someone new, a family friend. As it turned out, from her same world of security and wealth. I saw him a few times at parties. Polite but distant, as if he were sizing me up in the back of his mind. And in those moments, I knew it was time to distance myself. 2. I accepted a job offer in another city. A clean slate that I needed more than I realized at the time. I found new friends, poured myself into work, and even tried dating again. Though nothing serious, I'd hear about Lisa now and then through mutual friends, updates on her life and eventually, the news of her engagement. Part of me felt relieved when I heard she'd found someone who could give her everything I couldn't. They got married 6 months ago. And while I wasn't invited, I didn't expect to be. I had put her behind me. A chapter closed, or so I thought. Then, 3 weeks ago, an unknown number called me. And when I picked up, it was her. We slipped into conversation easily. Almost too easily. It felt strange, nostalgic even, as if we'd never stopped talking. She told me about her new house, her job, and the plans she was making with her husband. I told her about my work, my new city, and the friends I'd made here. There was a sense of comfort, a shared history between us. And despite my better judgment, I let myself enjoy it. I told myself it was just catching up with an old friend. Nothing more. But then, the calls and messages didn't stop. The day after, she sent me photos of her new house, a sprawling, modern structure with views I could only dream of. I complimented her on it, thinking that would be the end of it. But she started reaching out more frequently. She'd call, saying she was out for a drive and thought of me, wanting to hear how I was adjusting to my new life. She even sent me TikToks, memes, random things she thought would make me laugh. At first, it was harmless, but over the next 2 weeks, her contact became almost daily. Calls, texts, photos, Small details of her life that didn't seem like the kind of things you'd share with someone who was supposed to be a distant memory. It wasn't lost on me that she was now married. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more behind her sudden desire to reconnect. I started to wonder if she was happy in her marriage. Or if there was something else that she wasn't saying. Was she lonely? Bored? Or maybe she just missed the connection we once shared. I didn't know, but every time I heard her voice, felt the warmth in her tone, it pulled at memories I had tried so hard to leave behind. It was nice at first, catching up with her, but it quickly started to feel wrong. The line between friendly nostalgia and something more was blurring, and I could feel myself being drawn back to a place I wasn't sure I wanted to be. I was happy for her, genuinely, but I also felt protective of myself. I had worked hard to move on, to build a life that didn't revolve around her. And now, here she was, married, yet pulling me back in with every call, every message. The connection that I thought I'd put to rest was beginning to stir, leaving me unsettled. I couldn't ignore the growing tension between what was comfortable and what was appropriate. This wasn't the life I'd envisioned for myself, entangled with a married woman. Even if that woman was someone I had once loved deeply, it wasn't what I wanted to be a part of. Not now, not ever. After one particularly long call, I sat alone, the phone still warm in my hand, and realized that I needed to make a choice. My friends might have thought I was overthinking things, but I knew that the boundaries between us were starting to erode. And while it felt comforting to reconnect with her, there was something unsteady about it all, as if her presence was drawing me back to an old wound that hadn't fully healed. I needed to decide what mattered more, the comfort of nostalgia or the clarity of moving forward. I could tell that she was looking for something, some reassurance, some comfort that I wasn't sure I could, or should, give. So, after a long night wrestling with my thoughts, I made a decision. I had to put up boundaries, to reclaim the space I had built for myself without her. I messaged her, gently explaining that while I valued our past and cared about her well-being, it didn't feel right to stay in touch so often now that she was married. I told her that maybe it was best for us to let go, to allow each other the freedom to fully embrace the lives we'd chosen separately. She replied almost immediately, assuring me that our friendship was innocent, that there was nothing wrong with us staying close. But I knew that staying close wasn't an option for me. Not anymore. So I made the decision to block her, to sever the link that had started to pull me back into the past. It wasn't easy, and a part of me felt guilty, wondering if I was being too harsh, too protective of my own space. But I knew it was the right thing to do, for both of us. And now, in the silence that followed, I wondered if I'd made a mistake. Friends started reaching out, telling me I was overreacting, that I should at least be there for her as a friend. Jess, a close friend of both of us, even told me that Lisa was upset, saying that I had cut her off without a proper explanation. The accusations stung, and I found myself doubting my choice all over again. Had I misread her intentions? Had I hurt someone who was just reaching out for friendship? But as I sat there, replaying our conversations, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had done the right thing. Lisa had moved on, built a new life with someone else, and I needed to let go, truly and fully. I had closed the door to my past for a reason, and as painful as it was, I knew I couldn't go back now. The days after I blocked Lisa's number felt like they were moving in slow motion. I had spent hours after cutting her off thinking about whether I'd overreacted, whether I should have just let things be, played along, kept it casual. I wasn't losing sleep exactly, but there was a restlessness that stayed with me, as though a part of me kept looking over my shoulder, waiting for her next move. It wasn't long before Jess called to let me know that Lisa was more upset than she'd let on. Jess started by trying to sound neutral, talking about a work project, but eventually, she pivoted. "You know, Lisa feels blindsided," she said. "I mean, she thought you two were reconnecting." I'd never told Jess or any of our friends about the whole scope of my feelings after Lisa and I broke up. But she'd sensed my struggle. Hearing her say that Lisa felt blindsided was both unexpected and, strangely, aggravating. Blindsided? I could almost laugh. Lisa had been the one to end things, to tell me plainly that she wanted a life I couldn't give her. I'd respected that, even if it hurt more than I could admit. I'd even been grateful in a way, because I knew it was for the best. She deserved what she wanted, and I deserved a life where I wasn't constantly scrambling to measure up. So what was she expecting now? Look, Jess, I said, trying to keep my tone calm. I didn't block her because I hate her. I just think it's not appropriate for us to talk so often. Given her situation. Jess sighed, probably wanting to say more but holding back. I get it, but maybe she just wanted someone she felt comfortable with. Someone who understands her, you know? I hung up feeling frustrated. The problem was that I did understand. I knew Lisa, maybe better than anyone else ever had. And part of me still cared deeply about her. But I couldn't shake the feeling that her marriage was her new world now. She'd chosen it, and that choice had consequences. My cutting her off wasn't to hurt her. It was a way for me to protect myself from getting sucked back into a place where I had to question every feeling. Every memory. But a few days later, another unknown number appeared on my phone. My stomach sank when I realized it might be her. After staring at the screen, debating whether to answer, I let it ring until it went to voicemail. The message was brief, her voice low and tentative, as if testing the waters. I just wanted to talk. She said, please don't just cut me off like this. I miss our friendship. I deleted the message, refusing to let myself overthink it. But the words stayed with me. The next morning, I woke up to a flurry of missed calls and messages. Some were from unknown numbers. Some from mutual friends, all urging me to call her back, to at least give her the chance to explain herself. By the time I was sitting at my desk at work, I felt as though her presence was hovering over me like a shadow I couldn't shake. Her messages were polite, yet persistent, and she had even sent me a few photos from a recent party with our mutual friends. I didn't respond, but the effort it took to ignore her was draining me. On some level, it felt good to know she missed our friendship. I'd spent years being the one who missed her, who felt the absence of someone who had been such a huge part of my life. But this wasn't just catching up over coffee and reminiscing about old times. She was now calling me nearly every day. I wasn't looking to fill the void in my life with memories of someone who had long since moved on. Despite myself, I found myself thinking back to the early days of our relationship. Wondering if I'd missed signs. If I'd misjudged her all those years ago. Maybe she had just needed time to grow into the life she thought she wanted. Maybe, had I been more patient, we could have worked things out. But those maybes were useless now. I'd moved to a new city for a reason. To start fresh. To leave behind the pain of constantly seeing her with someone else. And here she was, practically demanding her way back in. The next week was a blur of trying to keep my routine going while ignoring the pull of nostalgia that came with her every message. She didn't just stop at calling or texting. She began sending me TikToks, memes, funny links, all the little things she knew I'd laugh at. As though trying to break down my walls with small, familiar moments. I'd be lying if I said it didn't make me smile sometimes. But that didn't make it any less confusing. One evening, after she'd sent me a particularly funny TikTok, I found myself laughing, despite my better judgment, but then the discomfort crept in. Here was my ex. Someone who'd broken up with me because I couldn't provide the life she wanted, now trying to bring me back into her life. To stay connected in ways that felt far too intimate for a married woman. And it dawned on me that maybe there was more to it than I had originally thought. I started asking myself what I'd been avoiding. Why now? Was she unhappy? Was her husband neglectful? Or was she merely bored with the predictable stability she'd chosen? Each of these scenarios left me with more questions. And the closer I looked, the less I could reconcile the woman I'd known with the woman who was now reaching out. Insistent, as though our past could be effortlessly molded into a just friends relationship. Finally, I messaged her, deciding that clarity was better than ambiguity. I told her, as gently as I could, that I found it inappropriate to stay in touch so frequently given that she was married. I told her that while I appreciated our history and the memories we shared, it felt wrong to rekindle a connection that once ran so deep. Especially now that she'd chosen a life with someone else. She replied almost immediately, her tone defensive but determined. She argued that there was no harm in talking. That she valued me as a friend and couldn't see why marriage should change that. It was classic Lisa, finding a way to argue her way into whatever she wanted, even if it defied common sense. But I knew better now. I knew that I had to be firm. I told her I needed to focus on my work, on my own life, and that maintaining contact with her wasn't something I felt comfortable doing. I'd blocked her number for a reason, and I'd let it stay that way. I didn't need the distraction, the ambiguity, or the lingering sense of emotional entanglement. After that message, I blocked her again, hoping this time it would stick, that it would give me some peace. But, as expected, it didn't end there. Mutual friends began to chime in, taking her side, accusing me of overreacting and making a big deal out of nothing. They said she was lonely, that she missed her old friends, and that she didn't see any reason why a simple friendship should be a problem. Each accusation chipped away at my resolve, making me question if I'd done the right thing. Maybe they were right, maybe I was reading too much into it. But every time I tried to justify unblocking her, I reminded myself of the line between us, a line I'd fought hard to draw. To maintain, she had chosen her life, and I had respected that choice. I couldn't, and wouldn't, cross back over into a place I'd left behind for good reason. By now, I was exhausted by the back and forth, the cycle of doubt and guilt that I couldn't seem to escape. Each time I saw one of our friends or received another message asking why I was being so cold, I felt the weight of their judgment. It seemed no one else could see what I saw, the boundary that had been crossed. To them, it was just a friendship rekindled, nothing more, but to me, it felt like standing on the edge of a cliff, looking into a past I'd already worked so hard to move beyond. And so I stayed the course, choosing silence over engagement, hoping that, eventually, she'd get the message. But deep down, I knew this wasn't over. Lisa had always been persistent, and as much as I wanted to believe this was the end, a part of me feared that the real trouble was only just beginning. The decision to block Lisa again left me feeling strangely hollow. I'd done it as a way to reclaim control, to set boundaries that I knew were necessary for both of us. But in the days that followed, the silence felt heavy, as if I'd closed a door on a part of myself as well. I'd known Lisa deeply, she had been woven into my life, my dreams, my future plans, and while I had worked hard to let go, she'd somehow managed to slip back into my world, bringing with her memories I thought I'd buried. That hollow feeling was short-lived, though, as the backlash from our mutual friends quickly reminded me of why I'd set those boundaries in the first place. Messages poured in, and it seemed everyone had an opinion. They kept telling me that Lisa was hurt, that I'd blindsided her, cut her off without explanation. The more they pushed, the more I realized that she'd been telling them her side, painting herself as the wronged friend reaching out in innocence, blindsided by my cold behavior. It felt like I was in the middle of a tug of war, with people pulling me back toward her, unable to see why I needed to keep my distance. One night, Jess, our mutual friend who had always been close to Lisa, texted me, practically begging me to talk things out. I hadn't planned on responding, but Jess could be persistent when she wanted something. And eventually, I gave in. We agreed to meet up for coffee, and I spent the entire drive to the cafe rehearsing what I'd say, trying to keep my frustration from boiling over. Jess wasted no time once we sat down. "Do you really think it's fair to just block her out of your life like that?" she asked. Eyes fixed on me, searching for something in my expression. "I mean, she's hurting, too. You know, you meant a lot to her." I took a deep breath, reminding myself to stay calm. "I get that, Jess, but Lisa is married now. There are boundaries that I need to respect. And honestly, that she should respect, too. It's not the same as it was before." Jess leaned forward, frowning, but she only wanted to catch up. "You two were best friends before anything else. Isn't it possible to keep that part?" Best friends. I could feel the weight of those words, the familiarity and comfort that our friendship had once brought. But I knew, better than anyone, that we'd crossed that line long ago. We weren't just friends, and it wasn't just catching up anymore. I'd spent 2 years healing, rebuilding my life without her, and now it felt like everyone around me was asking me to step back into that past as though none of it had ever happened. I tried to explain, picking my words carefully. "I'm not trying to hurt her, but keeping in touch so often, it feels wrong. Maybe it's fine for her, but for me, it just brings up too much. And besides, shouldn't she be focused on her marriage?" Jess fell quiet, fiddling with her coffee cup. She told me she wasn't exactly happy. I didn't want to say anything, but she's been feeling lonely. "I think she misses having someone who truly understands her." Jess's words hung in the air, thick with unspoken questions. There it was, the quiet truth I'd been avoiding, the suspicion that had been gnawing at me since Lisa's first message. She was lonely. She missed the connection we once had, the way we'd known each other's lives inside and out. But I couldn't be that person for her anymore. I wasn't her emotional safety net. Not when she'd chosen to be with someone else. After my coffee with Jess, I tried to move forward, hoping that my silence would eventually communicate what words had failed to. But Lisa wasn't one to give up easily. A few days later, another unknown number called. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity got the better of me, and I picked up. It was her. "Please, just hear me out," she said, her voice softer than usual, almost pleading. I felt my defenses start to slip. This was a woman I'd loved deeply once. Someone who, despite everything, still held a part of my heart. But I forced myself to stay silent, to listen without letting myself get drawn back in. She apologized first, thanking me for picking up and explaining that she hadn't intended to overwhelm me. She told me she felt like she was spiraling, that life had become so much more complicated than she'd expected. I didn't know who else to turn to, she said, and I could hear the strain in her voice, a vulnerability that was rare for her. As she spoke, I felt a pang of sympathy. I knew what it was like to feel lost, to feel like the world you'd imagined was slipping away. She told me about her marriage in vague terms, hinting at troubles but not going into detail. The loneliness in her voice was real, but so was my growing sense of discomfort. I wanted to be there for her, to ease her pain, but I could also feel the weight of her presence pushing into my life, breaking down the boundaries I tried to build. When she finished, she took a shaky breath and said, "I just need someone who understands. Someone who knows me like you do." The words were heavy, carrying a longing that I recognized all too well. But I couldn't ignore the reality of her situation. She was married, she had made her choice. And while I understood her pain, I couldn't let myself get pulled back into it. "I'm sorry, Lisa," I replied, my voice firmer than I'd expected. "I can't be that person for you anymore." The silence on the other end was thick, filled with the things we both couldn't say. And then, almost as if she'd expected it, she sighed. "I guess I shouldn't have called. I didn't know what else to do." I wanted to tell her that she'd be okay, that she was strong enough to handle whatever came her way. But I knew that wasn't what she wanted to hear. She wanted me to say that I'd be there for her, that we could go back to the way things had been, that I'd help her through this like I had once before. But I couldn't do that. Not anymore. After we hung up, the guilt washed over me again, a tide of memories and emotions that made it hard to breathe. I spent hours replaying her words, wondering if I'd been too harsh, if I'd let my own fears get in the way of being a good friend. But every time I thought about reaching out, about undoing the block, I stopped myself, reminding myself of the line I'd drawn. Lisa didn't stop reaching out. She called Jess and a few others, telling them about our conversation, framing it as though I'd abandoned her when she needed someone the most. Mutual friends texted and called, some telling me I should be there for her, others supporting my decision to move on. The mixed messages left me feeling torn. And once again, I found myself wondering if I'd done the right thing. But deep down, I knew the truth. I wasn't the person she needed anymore. And I couldn't sacrifice my own peace, my own progress, just to ease her pain. She had a husband now, a life she'd chosen, and she had to face the reality of it, just as I had faced mine when she left. In the end, I stayed resolute, keeping my distance even as the accusations and guilt weighed down on me. It wasn't easy, and there were nights when I lay awake, questioning every choice I'd made, wondering if I'd been cruel or selfish. But I reminded myself that some boundaries are necessary, even when they hurt. The days stretched on, and gradually, her calls and messages slowed. It was a relief, but also a reminder of the finality of my decision. I had chosen to put my well-being first, to let go of a past that had once meant everything to me. And while the pain of that choice lingered, I knew it was the only way forward, for both of us. The calls and messages from our friends began to taper off over the next few days. But the sting of their words lingered. I could still feel the weight of their opinions pressing down on me, their voices echoing in my mind every time I tried to let go. Even though I knew I'd done the right thing, the guilt sat heavy, filling the spaces where peace should have been. One evening, I found myself scrolling through old photos on my phone. Pictures of college parties, road trips, lazy afternoons with our group of friends. Lisa was in so many of them, smiling, her face illuminated by sunlight or laughter. We'd been a part of each other's lives in a way that I'd once thought would last forever. The photos reminded me of the version of her I'd loved, the woman who had been both my best friend and my partner. Seeing those images was like reopening a book I'd left behind on purpose. Its pages filled with memories I'd carefully boxed up and tried to forget. I missed those moments, that sense of ease and belonging. And I missed the people who had been there with us. The friends who'd shared in our lives and now seemed to judge me for putting up walls. Walls that felt necessary but looked harsh from the outside. One morning, I received a message from Mark, one of the few friends I'd managed to stay close with since the breakup. He'd always been understanding, the kind of friend who gave advice without judgment. His message was simple. Hey, can we meet up? Just want to chat. No pressure. We met at a coffee shop we'd been going to for years. One of those places that felt like home. Mark arrived, flashing me a quick smile as he sat down. He ordered a coffee and waited a few moments before speaking, letting the tension settle between us. Then, he leaned forward, his voice low. I don't want to pick sides. He started, his tone cautious. But I think you're dealing with this better than most people would. He paused, his eyes meeting mine. I get why you blocked her. But I also understand why she'd feel hurt. You guys were close for a long time. I nodded, feeling a wave of gratitude that at least Mark understood. I know, and I hate that I've hurt her. But I can't pretend that things are the same. I can't be her fallback when she's supposed to be living this life she chose. It feels wrong, and maybe selfish, but I need this distance. Mark took a sip of his coffee. Thinking, it's complicated, he said finally. And I get that Lisa's going through her own stuff. But it sounds like you've set boundaries that make sense. Honestly, I think more people should be doing that. We spent the next hour talking. And for the first time in weeks, I felt the pressure ease. Mark didn't try to push me one way or the other, he just listened. His occasional nods and reassurances keeping me grounded. By the time we left, I felt lighter. More certain that I could keep going without constantly questioning myself. But the relief didn't last long. Not a day later, Jess called again, this time with a hint of anger in her voice. You know, I really thought you'd come around by now. She said, almost accusingly. Lisa's devastated, and you're just moving on like none of it matters. That's harsh. The words struck hard, each one a small reminder of the guilt that I'd been trying so hard to keep at bay. I wanted to tell her that it wasn't about ignoring Lisa's pain. That I felt every bit of it. But I knew Jess wouldn't see it that way. In her eyes, I was the one choosing to leave Lisa alone when she needed someone. And no amount of explanation could change that. Jess, you're not seeing the whole picture. I said, trying to stay calm. I spent years moving on from Lisa. Blocking her wasn't easy. I had to do it to protect myself. If I go back now, I'd be undoing all of that. She's married. There are boundaries, and I can't be the person she leans on anymore. It's not fair to either of us. But Jess was unmoved. So you're just going to ignore her? After everything you two had? Her words stung, but I forced myself to remain firm. I couldn't allow her or anyone else to dictate my choices. I was the one who had to live with them. The one who had put in the work to rebuild my life. I didn't want to hurt Lisa. But I also knew that crossing back into that part of my life would only cause more pain. I hung up, feeling a mix of anger and sadness. It felt as if my decision had been reduced to a simple choice between right and wrong. And everyone else had somehow concluded that I was wrong. The same doubts crept back in. Shadows of guilt and second-guessing that had me staring at my phone. Wondering if I should unblock her. If I should reach out to let her know I hadn't meant to hurt her. A few days passed, and in that time, I managed to keep myself busy. Throwing myself into work, exercise, anything that would distract me from the mental tug-of-war Lisa's absence had created. But the silence from her end felt deafening. As though there was an unspoken expectation between us. A sense that one of us had to reach out to break it. One night, as I was getting ready to go to bed, another unknown number popped up on my phone. I froze, my heart racing, half knowing it was her. I hesitated, my thumb hovering over the screen, debating whether to answer, but something inside me urged me to let it ring, to give myself that moment to choose. As the call went to voicemail, I felt a strange sense of relief. Whatever she wanted to say, whatever explanations or feelings she needed to unload, I wasn't ready to hear them. When I finally listened to the voicemail later that night, it was short, her voice tight with something between anger and desperation. I just want to know why. Why you're shutting me out like this? I thought we were better than that. The question lingered, her voice replaying in my mind as I tried to sleep. I couldn't answer it, not in a way she'd understand. To her, It probably seemed like I was abandoning her, like I'd taken our friendship and tossed it aside. But to me, this was about self-preservation, about making sure I didn't drown in feelings I'd fought so hard to overcome. It was hard to admit, even to myself, but a part of me still cared deeply about Lisa. Maybe that was why it hurt so much to block her out. Why every message, every accusation from friends, felt like a knife twisting in the wounds I thought had healed. I wasn't shutting her out because I hated her, I was shutting her out because I cared too much to let myself get drawn back in. Over the next few days, I did my best to stay focused on my own life, pushing through the guilt that Jess and others had planted in me. But each time I silenced another unknown call or ignored another message, the guilt would return, reminding me of the person I'd once been, the friend I'd once promised to be. But I knew, deep down, that these boundaries were the only way forward. The man who had once loved Lisa, who would have done anything to make her happy, was gone. In his place was someone who understood his worth, who knew the importance of self-respect and the pain of letting go. And as hard as it was to keep shutting her out, I knew it was the only way I could hold on to the life I'd worked so hard to build. A few weeks after the flurry of messages and unknown calls, things had started to settle. Or maybe I just convinced myself they had. The silence was both a relief and a weight, like the calm before a storm I couldn't fully prepare for. But then, just as I was beginning to find a fragile sense of peace, the storm broke. Late one Friday night, I received a message from Jess. She told me that Lisa wanted to speak with me one last time. That she was really struggling and didn't know who else to turn to. I hesitated, my finger hovering over the reply button, knowing that stepping back into Lisa's world was the last thing I should do. But Jess's words lingered in my mind, a reminder that Lisa was hurting in ways I couldn't begin to understand. Against my better judgment, I agreed, telling Jess to pass on that I'd speak with her. Just this once. On Saturday morning, my phone rang, and I answered, bracing myself for whatever lay on the other end. "Hey," she said, her voice quiet and shaky. I could hear the vulnerability in it, a rawness that took me off guard. "Lisa," I replied, trying to keep my tone neutral. "I'm here. What's going on?" There was a pause, a small intake of breath, as though she were gathering the strength to continue. Then she started talking, her words spilling out in a way that felt rushed, frantic, as if she feared losing her nerve. She told me about her husband, Jason, the man she'd chosen to build a life with, the man she'd left me behind for. As she spoke, I began to see the pieces of her life falling apart, the cracks that had been hidden beneath the polished surface of her marriage. She told me about a party she and Jason had attended, how one of his friends had made a pass at her, touching her in ways that were anything but friendly. When she'd told Jason about it, expecting anger, protection, anything, he'd simply brushed it off, saying she needed to loosen up and enjoy the party. I could feel my grip tightening on the phone, anger rising as she continued, describing how Jason had become increasingly distant, dismissive, wrapped up in a social circle that reveled in a lifestyle she hadn't anticipated. Over the past few months, she'd uncovered things she could barely bring herself to say: Jason's drug use, his casual affairs with his friends' wives, things he claimed were normal in his world. And worse, she suspected he'd been unfaithful while they were dating and possibly after they were married. The words came quickly, like she was trying to purge herself of the memories. I tried to tell my mom. She whispered, but she just told me to work harder to make him happy, to keep him from looking elsewhere. Her voice wavered, and I could feel the weight of her isolation, the emptiness of a life she'd thought would be perfect. But it didn't stop there. She told me that there had been instances of physical abuse, moments when Jason's frustration had boiled over into violence. She wouldn't go into detail, but the pain in her voice was unmistakable. She was trapped, surrounded by people who couldn't or wouldn't help her, people who were more concerned with appearances than her well-being. I listened, barely able to breathe, feeling a mix of anger, sadness, and a fierce protectiveness I hadn't felt in years. The woman on the other end of the line was nothing like the confident, carefree Lisa I'd known. She was broken, a shadow of the person I'd once loved. And as much as I wanted to keep my distance, I couldn't turn away from her pain. "I don't know what to do," she said, her voice a whisper. "I don't trust anyone else. I'm so sorry for dragging you into this." But I didn't know where else to turn. I felt torn, trapped between the boundaries I'd set for myself and the instinct to protect her. To help her escape the life that was destroying her. She told me that she'd thought about leaving but couldn't. Jason controlled her finances, monitored her movements, and had even limited her access to her own bank accounts. She didn't feel safe, didn't trust anyone in her current life to help her. And I was the last person she felt she could turn to. My mind raced as she told me that all she wanted was to escape. To get away from him, even if just for a short while. She asked, almost apologetically, if I could buy her a plane ticket to my city. Somewhere she could think, breathe, and decide her next steps without Jason's shadow looming over her. There was a moment of hesitation. A second where I questioned everything. Was this the right thing to do? Could I really help her without getting entangled in her life again? Without risking everything I'd worked to rebuild? But as I listened to her voice, heard the desperation and fear, I knew I couldn't just stand by and do nothing. She needed help, and I was the only one who could give it. So, I agreed. I told her I'd get the ticket, that she could stay in my guest room, and that I'd help her figure out her next steps. I arranged the ticket carefully, making sure there was no digital trail that Jason could trace back to her. I sent her the confirmation details, telling her only to check them once she was at the airport. The plan was precarious, risky, but it was the best we could do under the circumstances. That night, I barely slept, my mind swirling with anxiety and anticipation. I'd spent years keeping my distance, rebuilding myself piece by piece. And now, in a matter of days, I was pulling her back into my life, opening a door I'd promised myself I'd close forever. But I knew this was bigger than the boundaries I'd set. Lisa needed me, truly needed me, and that was something I couldn't ignore. The following day, she texted me from the airport, letting me know she was on her way. I could feel my heart pounding, a strange mixture of dread and relief. Knowing that she was finally escaping, finally taking the steps she needed to protect herself. I waited for hours, pacing, trying to distract myself, but the minutes felt like hours until, finally, she arrived. When she walked through the door, I barely recognized her. She looked exhausted, worn down, her eyes hollow. She was carrying only a small bag, as if she'd left everything else behind in her rush to get away. She gave me a small, grateful smile, and for a moment, we just stood there, the weight of everything unsaid hanging between us. In the days that followed, she settled into the guest room, a quiet presence that seemed to haunt the apartment, filling it with memories and emotions I hadn't felt in years. She rarely spoke about Jason or her family, only telling me that her mother had tried to convince her to return. To fix her marriage for the sake of the family's reputation. Her friends, too, had sided with Jason, dismissing her concerns, choosing to ignore the truth she was so desperate to reveal. But I could see the toll it had taken on her. She would wake up in the middle of the night, her face streaked with tears, her hands trembling as she tried to hold herself together. She wasn't the vibrant, confident woman I remembered. She was someone else. Someone who'd been stripped of everything she'd once believed in, left to face the harsh reality of a life she couldn't escape. Over time, as she grew more comfortable, she began to open up, sharing bits and pieces of her experiences. The things Jason had done, the ways he'd controlled her, isolated her. Each story was like a small piece of the puzzle, a glimpse into the nightmare she'd endured. And with each revelation, I felt my anger grow, a simmering rage that I struggled to contain. She had offered to pay rent, but I'd refused, telling her to save whatever she could for the legal battle she'd inevitably face. Her parents had cut her off, and she had few allies left. The friends we'd once shared now divided, many of them siding with Jason. But I didn't care about any of that. All I cared about was helping her find a way out, giving her the strength to reclaim the life she'd lost. As the days turned into weeks, I found myself facing a strange new reality, one where my ex was living under my roof, a constant reminder of the life we'd once shared, the love we'd once had. But this time, it was different. This wasn't about rekindling old feelings or revisiting the past. It was about survival, about helping someone I once loved escape the chains of a life that had left her broken. And yet, as much as I tried to keep my distance, to remain detached, I couldn't ignore the part of me that still cared. The part of me that wanted to see her whole again. I didn't know what the future held. Didn't know if this would be the beginning of something new or just a chapter we'd close once she was ready to move on. But for now, I knew one thing. I couldn't turn my back on her. Not when she needed me the most. And so, I made a silent promise to stand by her side, to help her through this storm, no matter what it cost me in the end. Over the days that Lisa stayed with me, I witnessed her struggle in ways I hadn't anticipated. She was like a ghost, haunted by shadows that I couldn't see but could feel. Every time I thought she might be finding her footing, something would happen to remind her of what she'd left behind, and she'd fall back into a quiet despair. It was heartbreaking to see her like this, a woman who had once been so full of life, now reduced to someone who flinched at the sound of her own phone vibrating. At first, I tried to give her space, figuring she'd open up when she was ready. I kept my usual routine, trying not to crowd her, but I made sure she knew I was there if she needed to talk. Eventually, she began sharing small details of what she had endured, bits and pieces of the life she had with Jason. The more she revealed, the more horrified I became, realizing how deeply she'd been isolated and controlled. He had woven his way into every part of her life, taking over her finances, limiting her social interactions, and keeping her constantly under his thumb. One afternoon, after a particularly intense conversation where she'd recounted more of Jason's cruelty, I suggested she consider getting legal help. It was a sensitive subject. I knew the idea of confronting Jason, of potentially facing him in court, terrified her, but I also knew she couldn't keep hiding from him, couldn't live in fear of what he might do. She looked at me, her expression weary but resolute. "I don't know where to start," she whispered. "I don't have any money to my name. Not anymore. He's made sure of that." I took a breath, reminding myself to stay calm. "Look, I know this is overwhelming, but there are resources out there. We can look into shelters or support services for women in your situation. I can help you with legal fees if it comes to that. You don't have to do this alone." Her eyes filled with tears, and she nodded, a small gesture that felt like a glimmer of hope. Together, we sat down and started researching lawyers in the area who specialized in divorce and domestic abuse cases. I found a local attorney known for taking on difficult cases, someone who could advocate for her without charging exorbitant fees up front. Lisa hesitated, worried that seeking a lawyer might escalate things. But I reassured her, reminding her that she had a right to be safe, a right to her own life. The next day, she and I met with the attorney, a woman named Catherine who was empathetic and supportive but also firm. Laying out what needed to be done, Catherine explained that the process wouldn't be easy and that Jason might try to retaliate or manipulate the situation. She recommended Lisa file a restraining order if she feared he would come after her. Which, judging by Lisa's reaction, was an idea she had never fully considered. After the meeting, Lisa seemed even more emotionally exhausted, but there was a resolve in her that I hadn't seen before. She was finally taking steps toward freedom, and as daunting as it was, I could see she was determined to follow through. As the days went on, Jason's reaction began to reveal itself. When he realized she was truly gone, his initial response had been a flurry of text messages and missed calls. Some pleading for her to come back, others angry and accusatory. Lisa ignored them at first, but one night, curiosity got the best of her, and she looked through a series of messages he had sent. "He's saying that I'm the one who ruined everything," she said, showing me the phone, "that I betrayed him by leaving, that I'm making a big deal out of nothing." She shook her head, her hands trembling. "He's trying to make me doubt myself." Even now, I could feel the anger bubbling up in me, but I held it back, not wanting to add to her distress. "That's exactly why you left, Lisa," I said, my voice steady, "because he won't take responsibility. He wants you to feel guilty so he can control you." She nodded, a small, tired smile crossing her face. "Thank you," she whispered, "for reminding me." Things grew more intense after that. Jason's messages became increasingly threatening, demanding she return or face the consequences. He even reached out to her parents, who were still pressuring her to return and fix things. I could see the toll it was taking on her, the emotional burden of trying to stand firm against a man who had dominated her life and a family more concerned with appearances than her safety. One evening, after another confrontation with her parents, Lisa broke down, her hands covering her face as she sobbed. She was overwhelmed, torn between the expectations of her family and her own need for freedom. Sitting beside her, I did my best to offer comfort. Known words could only do so much. She clung to my hand, her fingers digging into my palm as if she feared letting go would mean slipping back into the life she'd fought so hard to escape. "I don't think I can do this," she whispered, her voice cracking. "It's like everyone wants me to go back. Like none of this matters to them." I looked at her, meeting her gaze with as much conviction as I could muster. "They may want you to go back, Lisa, but that doesn't mean you have to. You're stronger than you think. You've already made it this far." Her shoulders slumped, but I could see a flicker of determination in her eyes. "I don't want to go back," she said quietly, almost to herself. "I can't." We took each step cautiously, navigating her options, seeking financial aid for her legal expenses, and researching support groups. We even began looking at housing options, realizing that she couldn't stay with me forever. She needed a place of her own, somewhere she could rebuild her life without the shadow of Jason looming over her. As Lisa started planning her future, the small victories began to add up. She found a part-time job that allowed her to work remotely, something that offered both income and flexibility while she focused on her legal battle. I helped her set up a bank account that Jason couldn't access, finally giving her a sense of independence that she hadn't felt in years. But it wasn't all progress. There were setbacks, moments when the weight of her circumstances would crush her spirit, and she'd retreat into herself, quiet and withdrawn. Those nights were the hardest, watching her struggle in silence, knowing I could do little more than offer a shoulder to lean on. The accusations from friends continued, many of them convinced that we were hiding something, that Lisa had left Jason for me. People who had once been close to us had turned away, choosing to believe Jason's version of events rather than face the truth. We'd even been removed from group chats, blocked by mutual friends, effectively cut off from the circle we had once shared. It was painful, but as time went on, I found myself caring less about the opinions of others. Their judgments felt distant, insignificant in the face of what Lisa was going through. They didn't see the nights she spent wrestling with her memories, the scars that Jason's actions had left on her soul. They didn't see the courage it took for her to keep fighting, to keep pushing forward despite everything and everyone trying to pull her back. Each day, I felt my role shifting. I was no longer just her friend or her confidant. I was becoming a source of strength, a foundation she could rely on as she navigated this new chapter. And while it was a weight I hadn't anticipated carrying, I took it on willingly, knowing that she needed someone who believed in her, someone who could remind her of her worth. We continued moving forward, step by step, through the legal proceedings, the financial hurdles, and the emotional trials that came with her journey. And as I stood by her, helping her build a life that was truly her own, I realized something that had been simmering beneath the surface all along. This wasn't just about helping an old love escape a toxic marriage. It was about redemption, about giving both of us a chance to heal from the past, to find strength in the places we'd once been broken. Lisa's journey to freedom was also a journey of self-forgiveness for me. A chance to let go of the guilt and doubt that had haunted me since we'd parted ways. In helping her rebuild, I was, in a way, rebuilding myself, finding new meaning in the life I thought was complete. And as painful as this chapter was, I knew that, in the end, it was leading us both toward a freedom we hadn't known we needed. With each day that passed, it became clearer that the fallout from Lisa's decision to leave Jason wasn't just affecting her, it was impacting every aspect of both our lives. She hadn't been gone from him for long, but Jason and his allies wasted no time in attempting to control the narrative. Friends and acquaintances, people we'd once trusted, began to whisper. The quiet rumors turning into full-blown accusations. The insinuation that Lisa had left her husband for me spread like wildfire. At first, we tried to ignore it, brushing off the dismissive glances and cutting comments from people we'd once called friends. But as the days wore on, those moments grew harder to ignore. People who had once celebrated our friendship, who had laughed with us and shared in our lives, now treated us as though we were guilty of some unforgivable betrayal. Friends I'd known for years unfriended me on social media, their silence a loud declaration that they'd chosen Jason's side without even hearing Lisa's. One evening, Lisa and I went out for groceries, an errand that should have been simple but felt like stepping into enemy territory. As we moved through the aisles, picking out the essentials, I noticed a familiar face, Sarah, a friend from college who had once been close to both of us. She glanced our way, her eyes narrowing when they met mine. I raised my hand in a small wave, trying to bridge the distance, but she simply looked away, her expression hardening as she walked past us. The pain in Lisa's eyes was unmistakable. And I could feel my own frustration bubbling beneath the surface. "It's like they don't even want to hear my side," she said softly, her voice a mix of anger and sadness. "They'd rather believe a lie than face the truth." I tried to reassure her. But the words felt empty. The reality was that people had already made up their minds. And there was little we could do to change that. Jason had crafted a narrative that suited him, framing Lisa's decision to leave as an impulsive betrayal, an act of infidelity. The fact that she'd been fleeing a toxic, abusive situation was conveniently left out, glossed over in favor of a story that painted her as a villain. But it wasn't just friends who turned against us. Lisa's family had become a constant source of pain and confusion, their loyalties more firmly tied to appearances than to her well-being. Her father refused to speak with her, communicating only through her mother, who had flown to the city to talk sense into her. When Lisa's mother arrived, I left them alone in the apartment, giving them space to work through whatever they needed to. I knew that her mother's opinions held a certain weight with her, and I didn't want to complicate the situation by being there. Still, I could hear the muted voices, the tense exchanges as I waited in the hallway, trying to ignore the nervous tension building in my chest. After an hour, Lisa's mother left without so much as a glance in my direction. I walked back inside to find Lisa sitting on the edge of the couch. Her face pale, eyes hollow. She looked up at me, and I could see the heartbreak in her expression, a weight that seemed to press down on her shoulders. She kept saying I was being selfish. Lisa murmured, her voice barely above a whisper, that I was ruining the family's reputation, that I was just going through some phase I'd regret. I clenched my fists, anger simmering as I listened. "You don't owe them an explanation for choosing your safety. Lisa, you made the choice that was right for you." She looked at me, a tear slipping down her cheek. "It just hurts that they can't see that they don't want to see it." Seeing her pain, I felt a helplessness I couldn't shake. I'd thought that by helping her leave Jason, by giving her a safe place to start over, I could shield her from the worst of it. But I couldn't protect her from the disappointment of those closest to her, from the judgment that seemed to follow her everywhere. As the days passed, the whispers grew louder. Our friends, once a solid support system, had become a source of scrutiny. Some tried to be supportive but couldn't fully hide their doubt, while others cut ties completely, unwilling to even consider Lisa's side of the story. And I couldn't blame Lisa for feeling betrayed. She thought that these people, at least, would understand. Instead, they had chosen to believe the version of events that fit the easiest, one that didn't require them to confront the messy, uncomfortable truth. One night, Lisa and I sat together on the couch, an empty silence hanging between us. She looked drained, her eyes red from yet another round of silent tears. "I never thought it would be like this," she said, her voice a whisper. I thought at least some of them would believe me." I reached over, taking her hand in mine, offering what little comfort I could. "People don't want to believe things that disrupt their reality. It's easier to assume you're the one at fault than to acknowledge that Jason isn't who they thought he was." She nodded, but I could see the defeat in her posture, the way her shoulders slumped as if carrying a weight too heavy to bear. "It's just that every time I think I'm strong enough, something like this happens, and I feel like I'm back to square one." I held her hand, offering a gentle squeeze. "You're not back to square one. You've come further than you realize. And no matter what they say, you're doing what's right for you." The next morning, things reached a breaking point. Jason had somehow managed to get her family on a conference call. And her parents, already convinced she was ruining everything, pleaded with her to go back to him. Her father's voice echoed through the speakerphone, cold and authoritative. "You're making a fool of yourself. Lisa, do you really want to destroy everything we've worked for?" She listened, her face impassive, and when he finished, she simply hung up without another word. I could see the tears welling in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. For the first time, she seemed resolute, her gaze steady and unyielding. "I'm done trying to convince them," she said, her voice calm but filled with a quiet determination. "If they can't see the truth, then that's their problem. I can't keep sacrificing myself for their expectations." In that moment, I felt a surge of pride in her. She was finally taking back control, refusing to let their doubts and accusations define her. But I knew that this decision came at a steep price. She was effectively walking away from everyone who had once been her support system, choosing to rebuild a life without the people who had shaped her. And as for me, I could feel the growing tension within my own circles. People who had once seen me as a friend, as someone they could rely on, now looked at me with suspicion, convinced that Lisa and I were hiding something. It was a lonely place to be, trapped between a past I couldn't fully return to and a future that felt uncertain. In the days that followed, Lisa grew more resolute, throwing herself into plans for the future. She found a therapist, began applying for full-time jobs, and even started looking at apartments, determined to carve out a space that was truly her own. And while I continued to support her, to stand by her side, I could feel my own sense of isolation growing, the whispers and judgment eating away at me. One evening, as we sat on the balcony, watching the city lights twinkle in the distance, she turned to me, her expression filled with a gratitude I hadn't expected. "I don't know if I would have made it this far without you," she said softly. "Thank you, for everything." I looked at her, my heart heavy but filled with a quiet sense of purpose. "You would have done it on your own eventually," I replied. "You're stronger than you think, Lisa." She smiled, a genuine, hopeful smile that I hadn't seen in a long time. "Maybe, but having you here has made all the difference." As the city lights flickered in the distance, I realized that while the path we were on was fraught with challenges, it was leading us both to a place of healing and self-discovery. We were two people, brought back together under unexpected circumstances, each of us learning to rebuild in a world that no longer resembled the one we'd once known. And no matter what others thought, no matter the judgments or misunderstandings, I knew we were on the right path. We had found strength in each other, and as uncertain as the future felt, we would face it together, side by side, carving out a new reality built on resilience, respect, and an unwavering belief in each other's worth. Over the next several weeks, Lisa worked hard to rebuild her life, but it was clear that the scars Jason had left ran deep. She'd start each day with determination, pushing herself to stay focused on her goals. But as the days wore on, the strain would catch up to her, revealing itself in small, painful ways, a quiet sadness in her eyes, the way she'd flinch at loud noises, or her habit of checking over her shoulder whenever we were out in public. Living with her, I began to see the extent of what she'd endured. It wasn't just about breaking free from Jason's grip, it was about shedding the layers of fear, shame, and doubt he'd wrapped around her. The abuse she had endured wasn't merely physical or emotional, it had seeped into her very sense of self, making her doubt her own worth and judgment. I'd catch her sometimes in moments of silence, staring off into the distance, her thoughts miles away. When I asked her if she was okay, she'd give me a small smile, one that barely reached her eyes, and say, "I'm fine, just tired." But I knew it was more than that. Her exhaustion wasn't just physical, it was the kind of weariness that comes from carrying too much pain for too long. The worst of it was the nightmares. Nearly every night, I'd wake up to the sound of muffled cries or the unmistakable tremors of someone caught in a nightmare they couldn't escape. I'd rush to her room, gently waking her from whatever horror had seized her mind. She'd open her eyes, disoriented and vulnerable, clinging to me as though she were afraid she'd slip back into that dark place the moment she let go. One night, after yet another nightmare, she finally opened up about it. Sitting on the edge of her bed, wrapped in a blanket, she spoke softly, barely able to meet my eyes. "It's like he's still there," she whispered. "Even when I know he's not. Even when I'm safe, I can still feel him, in my mind, controlling everything I do." She told me how Jason's manipulation had made her question her every move, every word, every thought, how he'd make her believe she was the one at fault, that she was too demanding, too difficult, too weak. He'd chip away at her confidence, subtly at first, then more overtly as time went on, until she was left feeling like a stranger in her own life, convinced that she was undeserving of happiness, that she was somehow responsible for his actions. I listened, my heart breaking as she laid bare the twisted reality she'd endured. She hadn't just lost herself in that marriage, she'd been systematically erased. Her self-worth replaced by a deep-seated belief that she was unworthy of love or respect. The Lisa I had known, the vibrant, self-assured woman who had once lit up every room she entered, was now a shell of that person, her light dimmed by years of calculated cruelty. "Sometimes, I wonder if it's even worth trying to be happy again," she admitted, her voice trembling. "Like, what's the point if I'll just end up back where I started?" I took her hand, my voice steady but gentle. Lisa, you deserve happiness. You deserve a life where you're not constantly afraid. Where you don't have to question your own worth. What he did to you, it's not who you are." She looked at me, her eyes filled with tears. I want to believe that. But it's hard. Every time I try to move forward, I feel like he's right there. Like he's waiting to pull me back. Her words haunted me, and I knew that this wasn't something that would be fixed with a few comforting words or gestures. This was a journey, one that would take time and patience. One where she'd need to rebuild not just her life but her very sense of self. And I was determined to stand by her, to help her find her way back to the person she truly was. Over time, I encouraged her to talk to a therapist, someone who could help her untangle the web of trauma and self-doubt Jason had created. It took some convincing. Lisa was hesitant, almost afraid to confront the depths of her pain, but eventually, she agreed. She started attending weekly sessions. And though the process was slow and often painful, I could see glimpses of progress. Small shifts in her perspective. But it wasn't easy. Some days were better than others. Some days, she'd come home from a session looking more exhausted than when she'd left. Her face pale and her eyes clouded. Other days, she'd come back with a renewed sense of purpose, determined to reclaim the parts of herself that Jason had tried to take away. It was a roller coaster, each high and low a reminder of just how much work lay ahead. There were moments when her pain would overwhelm her, and she'd lash out, frustrated by the pace of her recovery. She'd apologize afterward, embarrassed and ashamed, but I'd reassure her that it was okay. That healing was messy and unpredictable. And in those moments, I could see the gratitude in her eyes. A small glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, she could find her way through this. One evening, after a particularly intense therapy session, she came home and sat beside me on the couch, her face etched with exhaustion. "Today, my therapist asked me what I want for my future," she said, her voice quiet, and I didn't know what to say. I realized that I haven't thought about my own future in years. All I've ever thought about is surviving. I nodded, understanding more than I could say. "Maybe now's the time to start thinking about it," I replied gently. "To start dreaming again." She looked at me, a faint smile playing on her lips. Dreaming, I almost forgot what that felt like. We sat in silence for a while, each of us lost in our own thoughts. I could see the battle she was fighting within herself, the tug of war between hope and fear, between the life she'd left behind and the one she was struggling to build. And I knew that as much as I wanted to help, this was a journey she'd have to take on her own, one step at a time. But as the weeks turned into months, I could see her resilience growing. She started talking about plans for her future, small, tentative ideas at first, then bigger goals, dreams she'd once abandoned. She mentioned going back to school, pursuing a career that would allow her to help others who had been through similar situations. It was as though she were piecing herself back together, slowly but surely, each dream a part of the person she was becoming. Through it all, I stood by her, offering support and encouragement, reminding her of her strength when she felt weak, of her worth when she felt unworthy. And in those moments, I realized that this journey wasn't just about helping her heal, it was about redefining the way we saw ourselves. About finding strength in vulnerability, and courage in compassion. One night, as we sat together on the balcony, watching the city lights flicker against the dark sky, she turned to me, her face softer, more at peace than I'd seen in a long time. "Thank you," she said, her voice filled with a quiet gratitude. "For everything. For believing in me when I couldn't believe in myself." I looked at her, my own heart full of gratitude. "You don't need me to believe in you, Lisa. You're stronger than you know." In that moment, I felt a profound sense of hope. A belief that maybe, despite everything, we could both find our way forward. Her journey was far from over. And I knew there would be more struggles, more moments of doubt and fear. But as I looked at her, I knew she was no longer alone. And neither was I. Lisa had survived the worst of it. And now, she was starting to thrive. She was learning to dream again. To imagine a future built not on fear or doubt, but on self-worth and resilience. And as she took each step forward, I felt my own heart begin to heal, finding solace in the knowledge that we were both rebuilding, together and yet separately, each of us finding our way toward a future filled with possibility. This was the life she deserved, the life she was finally beginning to believe in. And as her friend, her ally, I would be there to support her every step of the way. Knowing that whatever challenges lay ahead, She had the strength to face them, and so did I. As the months wore on, life with Lisa took on a new rhythm. The panic and chaos that had initially colored her stay began to give way to a more natural, calm routine. She and I fell into a quiet companionship, one marked by mutual respect, and, strangely enough, an even deeper friendship than we'd shared before. It was a friendship rooted in resilience, trust, and a shared understanding that went beyond our past. There were mornings when we'd sit together, sipping coffee in comfortable silence, looking out over the city as the sun painted the sky in shades of pink and orange. On those mornings, I could see hints of the old Lisa, the one who laughed easily, who loved to talk about her dreams and ambitions. She was slowly rediscovering herself, reclaiming the parts of her identity that Jason had tried to erase. And I was witnessing it, quietly cheering her on from the sidelines. She began to embrace the idea of independence, seeing it not as something forced upon her, but as a gift she was choosing to give herself. She talked about dreams she'd once buried, plans she'd postponed, things she hadn't dared to think about in years. At first, these were just tentative ideas, soft whispers of possibility. But over time, her confidence grew, and those ideas became plans, each one more exciting than the last. One evening, she surprised me by bringing up memories of our college years, reminiscing about shared classes, late-night study sessions, and all the small adventures we'd had. There was a nostalgic warmth in her eyes, a spark I hadn't seen in a long time. We laughed about old professors, remembered silly pranks, and talked about the dreams we'd had back then, the ones that had felt so close yet somehow slipped through our fingers as life took its course. "Do you remember that road trip we took up the coast senior year?" she asked, smiling. "The one where we got lost and ended up at that weird little diner?" I laughed, shaking my head. How could I forget? That place was like something out of a horror movie. "And you insisted we order food." She grinned, her eyes twinkling. "Hey, their pancakes were surprisingly good. Besides, that's what made it an adventure, right?" Her words lingered in the air, a reminder of simpler times, of a friendship that had once been the foundation of everything between us. In that moment, I realized that as much as we had both changed, there was a core of our relationship that had remained untouched, a friendship that had survived not just distance, but heartache, betrayal, and time. But as those memories resurfaced, so did the quiet questions I had pushed aside. There was a familiarity between us that was both comforting and confusing, an unspoken closeness that sometimes felt like more than friendship, even if we'd both silently agreed to keep it as such. And yet, the lines between friendship and something more felt blurrier than ever, caught somewhere between our past and the present. Late one night, after a quiet evening spent talking on the balcony, Lisa turned to me, her gaze thoughtful. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if things had been different?" she asked softly. The question hung in the air, heavy with the weight of everything we'd been through. "Sometimes," I admitted, choosing my words carefully, "but I think things happened the way they did for a reason. We both had to go through our own struggles to become who we are now." She nodded, her expression contemplative. "Maybe you're right, but I just wish I hadn't lost so much of myself along the way." I looked at her, feeling a mix of sadness and admiration. "You're finding yourself again, Lisa, and that's what matters now." In that quiet moment, I felt a deep sense of respect for her journey, a recognition of the strength it took for her to rebuild from the ground up. And I knew that, as much as I cared for her, the best thing I could do was support her without complicating things further. She needed this time to heal, to find her footing, to dream without the weight of anyone else's expectations. Still, the questions lingered in my mind. Could we ever be more than friends again? Did we even want to? And if so, was it something worth exploring? Or would it only pull us back into a place we'd already worked so hard to leave behind? In the weeks that followed, we continued to spend time together, finding joy in the small, ordinary moments. We'd cook dinner together, sharing old recipes and laughing over failed attempts. Some nights, we'd watch movies, making fun of plot holes and discussing which characters we'd most like to be. There was an ease between us that was comforting, a simplicity that didn't demand anything more than just being. Yet, there was a quiet electricity in the air, an unspoken connection that simmered beneath the surface. I couldn't deny it, and I knew she felt it too. But we were careful, almost cautious, as though both of us knew that acknowledging it might unravel everything we'd worked so hard to rebuild. Lisa, too, seemed to sense the delicate balance we'd struck. She had begun looking for apartments, eager to carve out a space of her own. It was bittersweet. I knew she needed her independence, needed a place where she could truly begin her new life. But part of me dreaded the day she would leave, worried that this chapter would close, that the bond we'd forged would fade with distance. One night, as she sat across from me, studying apartment listings on her laptop, she looked up, her expression serious. "I want you to know," she said, "that you've been the one constant through all of this. I don't think I could have done it without you." I felt a swell of emotion, a gratitude that ran deeper than words. "You're stronger than you give yourself credit for. Lisa, I might have been here, but you're the one who's done the work." She smiled, a quiet understanding passing between us. "Maybe, but you still made a difference. And I don't think I'll ever forget that." As she began making preparations to move into her own place, I found myself reflecting on everything we'd shared since she'd arrived. We'd gone from exes to friends, from strangers sharing a painful history to allies fighting for a future we both believed in. Our relationship had evolved into something that defied easy labels, something both familiar and profoundly new. But as the move-in date approached, I knew I had to make a choice. I could continue to play the role of supportive friend, giving her the space to build her life, or I could acknowledge the possibility of something more, a possibility that felt as terrifying as it was enticing. On her last night in my apartment, we sat together on the couch, the silence between us heavy but comfortable. She looked around, taking in the space that had become a safe haven for her, a place where she'd begun to reclaim herself. "It feels strange, leaving," she admitted, her voice soft. "This place, it became home in a way I didn't expect." I nodded, feeling the weight of her words. "You'll always have a home here, Lisa. Whatever you need, wherever you go, you know I'm here." She looked at me, her gaze filled with gratitude and something else, something unspoken. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything." We hugged, and in that embrace, I felt both the end of a chapter and the beginning of something new. As she pulled away, I knew that whatever happened next, whatever path we chose, we'd carry each other's support and respect. This journey had taught us both about resilience, friendship, and the importance of finding strength within ourselves. As she left the next day, moving into her own space, I watched her go with a sense of pride and quiet sadness. She was finally free, finally ready to face the world on her own terms. And while part of me feared losing her, I knew that, above all, this was the life she deserved, the life she had fought so hard to reclaim. In the days that followed, I felt the empty space she left behind. But it was a different kind of emptiness, one filled with hope rather than regret. I knew our story wasn't over, that whatever came next, we'd face it with the same strength and resilience that had carried us through. And as I went about my life, rediscovering my own dreams and ambitions, I found comfort in the knowledge that Lisa was out there, living a life that was truly her own. We had found our way back to each other, not as lovers, but as friends, allies, and kindred spirits. And that, I realized, was a bond that nothing could break. Watching Lisa walk out of my apartment for the last time felt surreal. She had come to me in pieces, fractured by a life that had left her weary, fearful, and stripped of hope. But as she closed the door behind her, I realized she was walking away as someone else, stronger, braver, and finally free. The first few days after she moved into her new place were oddly quiet. I missed our shared routines, the silent comfort of having someone beside me in the mornings and evenings. It felt strange to go back to the solitude I'd once cherished. And though I was proud of her, I couldn't shake the feeling that a chapter of my life had just ended. She was out there building her independence, and I knew I had to do the same. Lisa and I stayed in touch, of course. She'd text me updates about her new apartment, the first meal she cooked in her own kitchen, the plant she'd picked out to sit on her windowsill. Her excitement was contagious, and with each new step she took, I could feel her growing more certain of herself, more secure in her independence. But now our bond had taken on a new shape. She was no longer leaning on me, and I wasn't holding her up. We were moving forward separately, yet still connected by an unbreakable thread of understanding and respect. With Lisa settling into her own life, I found myself reflecting on my own. For years, I'd been caught between moving on from her and holding on to the person she'd been. Her sudden reappearance had stirred old feelings, challenging my sense of self and my place in the world. But now, without her here, I had the space to look inward, to ask myself who I wanted to be, not in relation to her, but in relation to my own dreams, my own future. Over the next few weeks, I began focusing on myself in a way I hadn't done in years. I returned to old hobbies, picked up projects I'd set aside, and even took on a new role at work, a challenge I had once hesitated to embrace. I found myself expanding, exploring parts of myself I'd neglected, parts that had lain dormant under layers of obligation, past heartache, and nostalgia. The journey was invigorating, a reminder that my life was my own to shape. One weekend, I visited Lisa at her new apartment. She'd decorated it with pieces that reflected her taste, a small tapestry on the wall, cozy throws over her couch, shelves lined with books she'd begun reading again. She was radiant, her face alight with the kind of happiness that comes from rediscovering oneself. Over tea, we laughed about the early days, about her arrival in my apartment and the whirlwind that had ensued. As we talked, I realized something. We'd managed to build something rare, something that had evolved through pain, support, and growth. Our friendship was deeper now, more resilient, forged in the fire of hardship and redemption. She no longer needed me as a crutch, and I no longer felt bound by my past feelings for her. We'd come to a place of mutual respect, each of us free to define ourselves without the weight of our shared history. Toward the end of our visit, Lisa looked at me thoughtfully. "You know, I don't think I'd be here without you," she said softly, "but I'm glad I've learned to stand on my own." Her words struck a chord in me, echoing something I'd felt but hadn't been able to articulate. "Me too," I replied, smiling. "And I think we both needed this journey, to realize we could be ourselves, independent of each other." We hugged as I left, a quiet understanding passing between us. It was a goodbye of sorts, not to our friendship, but to the parts of ourselves that had once been entangled in a way that neither of us could sustain. She was moving forward, and so was I, each of us with the strength to carve out our own paths. In the following months, Lisa's life flourished. She started working full-time at a nonprofit, advocating for survivors of domestic abuse. She became a voice of hope and resilience for others, using her own experience to empower people who felt trapped, just as she once had. She told me about her progress with a contagious excitement, and every success she shared filled me with pride. She'd transformed her pain into purpose, and I could see that she had finally found the life she deserved. Meanwhile, I focused on my own journey of self-redefinition. I invested more in my career, taking on projects I'd once shied away from, projects that challenged me and pushed me to grow. I reconnected with old friends, traveled to places I'd always wanted to see, and embraced the person I was becoming. My life began to feel expansive, like I was finally stepping into the fullest version of myself, unburdened by past regrets or lingering what-ifs. One evening, I sat alone on my balcony, watching the city lights twinkle below. The past year felt like a strange, beautiful dream, filled with pain, healing, and transformation. Helping Lisa had reminded me of the value of resilience, of compassion, of the power we all hold to rebuild our lives, no matter how broken we may feel. And in that process, I'd learned to forgive myself, to let go of the guilt I'd once carried over our past, to understand that our journey had led us both to exactly where we needed to be. The next time I saw Lisa, we were different people, whole, independent, and proud of who we had become. There was no lingering tension, no quiet longing or unspoken questions, just two people who had walked through fire, who had found their way back to themselves and each other, not as lovers, but as friends, stronger and more resilient than ever. As we hugged goodbye, I felt a profound sense of peace. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew that both of us would face it with strength, with courage, with the unshakable knowledge that we had already conquered so much. We had both learned to live fully, to embrace the lives we'd chosen, and to carry forward the lessons we'd gained. And for the first time, I felt truly free, free to dream, to love, to grow, and to build a life that was entirely my own. In the end, our story wasn't about reunion or romance. It was about healing, about rediscovering who we were beneath the layers of hurt and expectation. It was about friendship, resilience, and the beauty of two people finding their way to independence, to peace, and to a future filled with endless possibility.